Hi, Stacey Carr, Pueblo Laguna, and I'm a potter. So what we're going to do right now is, after we start mixing the clay with the water, we get it to this point where it's somewhat dry, but still kind of pliable. And then the purpose of what we do here is to remove all the air bubbles that are inside the clay, because the air bubbles are what causes the pottery to crack or to pop out when you actually fire it. So what we're doing is, it's just basically like kneading bread, and we'll string it out like this. And so you can actually, if you look at it from the top, you can see all the tiny little air bubbles that are still in there. There's little small air bubbles all the way through it. So we'll do this usually about 3 times, just knead the whole thing through. So you can see all these little air pockets in there. And so that's what you're trying to remove from the clay before you actually start making the powder. There'll still be a fair amount of air bubbles within it, but this takes out a good chunk of them. And it also allows the clay to dry a little bit if it's too wet. And what some people will do with their clays, at this point they'll start adding the pottery shards to it. So it'll actually help the clay adhere to itself. With this particular clay, it's so sticky as it is that I don't use any shards in it. Just because it's not really necessary to hold the pottery together. This is my studio. The only thing it's just an old school desk, but all I've done is change the top. And then once you get to that point, just use a spatula and you'll scrape it up. And once you get to this stage, then you can just mix it up. I think we'll just make one pottery with this one. Acoma has their own mine where they find the clay. The clay at Acoma, the color is a lot lighter. It's a real kind of a light gray clay, whereas you look at that, it's a little bit darker. The clay from Acoma, they usually require a lot of pottery shards to be put in it in order to hold the clay together. Whereas, like I said, with this one, it's naturally sticky, so you don't. I used to add shards to it, but then got to a point where it doesn't do any good or bad, whether you leave them in or out. So after painting and finishing the pottery, when you fire the pottery, that gray will actually turn into that white color. A lot of people use what's called a coil method, which is they'll take the clay and they'll roll it out into individual long pieces, and then they'll start putting them together over and over and over again to build a pot up. The way that I was taught was just take the ball of clay like this, put your thumb in the middle of it,
look at something, we can put it on the glass.
your thumb in the middle of it, and then you just start bringing it out from there.
Rather than scratching it or...
It makes a funny noise.
Yeah. We can put all those boxes together back there if you want. Well, these are for the items that are in here, yeah. And I'm going to change them out from these to the other ones. Oh.
And so you can see how the bottom is the clay is still pretty thick on the bottom here. So all I've done is bring out the wall a little bit.
Wow, you did that so fast.
And then you push in the bottom. Usually what I started with were just really small pots. I think the first pottery I ever made was probably that tall and that wide and probably about that thick. It was basically me just pushing my thumb in and do it. That's really how it was. And I remember painting it and firing it, and I sold it for $5.
Wow, that's so satisfying.
And so the lighter the pottery, the better. Heavy pottery does not sit well with a lot of people. And the Acomas are probably the most famous ones for making their pottery just incredibly thin. Now the difference with this clay and the red clay is that the red clay is a little more dense, and so it weighs a little bit more. And the fact that it doesn't stick together very well, the walls have to be thicker. So it's really, really difficult to get a light pottery in the red clay. The gray clay is really easy to work with. So what I do is just take a spoon, and what I'll do is I'll start bringing this out from in here. Usually I just start off with just a bowl like this, and then I can manipulate it later. If I want a wider bowl, I'll start making this lip a lot bigger at this stage. But with this, it's just probably going to be just a standard bowl. And then the tricky part, or I guess the hardest part, that kind of, when you talk about a class of potter, is the lip. That's like the biggest thing that, yeah, you can have a beautiful pottery, but if you look at it from this angle and the lip is kind of swaying a bit, that's not a very good quality pottery. So all I'm doing is bringing it out. And what this does is it starts giving the pottery its shape, but what it also does is it allows you to identify any air pockets that are in there, and so the spoon will sometimes either break them just by doing this, or else you have to get just a sharp knife or a toothpick or something, and then you poke them out. So the air pockets are probably the worst thing to pottery that you can have. It's nice and smooth in the middle. Okay, now it's still a little bit too wet to work with. You can see how it kind of bends, and it's not really holding its form very well. So what we'll do is you add water to the lip, because the lip is the last thing that you're going to work on with the smaller pots. With the larger pots, the lip is the first thing that you start with. So we'll just add water to that, and that just keeps it from drying, and then we'll set it up. Now we'll let it sit there for half an hour or so till it starts to dry out a little bit more. Then we'll start bringing it out again, and then we'll let that dry again, and then we'll start finishing the bottom, and then we can start on the top. So.